Welcome to Moonbeaming, a podcast about lunar living, magic, creativity, tarot, and more. I'm your host, Sarah Faith Gottesdiener, and I'm so honored and excited to be here with you today. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Moonbeaming, a podcast where we explore the magical and the mundane, a place where we have open conversations about all kinds of things, including, but not limited to, spirituality, reality, creativity, and more. Today on the show, we have a very special guest. We have the one and only Rocco Kayiatos. He is a writer, editor, musician, facilitator, so much more. Here is his bio. Rocco is a seasoned, integrated marketer that possesses expertise in new media, startups, and underrepresented audiences. His approach is equal parts scientist and artist. He has worked at a few of the biggest names in tech and has built and sustained multiple successful brands from scratch. He is a passionate storyteller who has dedicated his professional life to creating community and visibility for the lives, voices, and experiences lived outside the mainstream. He is gifted at removing barriers to understanding and creating an intimate and empathic relationship with an audience. I love Rocco. I consider him a good friend. He is someone I trust and admire. I'm thrilled to have him here today. He also wrote the June new moon entry for many moons, so you might recognize him from there. This was such a good talk. We talked about healing and about how becoming a safe person to yourself helps make you safer for other people. Rocco shared his insights about healthy masculinity and what he needed to let go of in order to have a healthier relationship with himself and his masculinity. We talked about power and about how shifting from a power over model to a power with model in his relationships with other men has been a radical and needed departure for him and is one way to divest from the patriarchy. If you are interested in transitions, transformation, healing, gender, queerness, relationships, we go into all of that and a lot more. The only announcement I have before getting into this week's episode is that June 2021 is full of workshops at the studio. We have a Decolonizing Boundaries workshop tonight with Dr. Jennifer Mulan. I think we closed the doors this morning. A plant amulets workshop with Liz from Sister Spinster this Sunday, and a spiritual foundations workshop that is being taught by special guest from last week, Keon, later this month. So come learn, come join, come have fun. There's always really beautiful people that come, and more info is linked in the show notes and, of course, on the studio site. Now I invite you to take a nice deep belly breath, maybe a nice long sip of some cool water, and enjoy my conversation with Rocco. I have such a special guest with me here today, someone I feel honored to call my friend. I have the one and only Rocco Kayiatos on the pod. Hello, Rocco.
Hi, I'm equally honored to be in this conversation with you and on this podcast.
Can you, I mean, from my vantage point, you're a writer, you're a facilitator, you're an artist, you're a musician, you run like multiple businesses, you have had an illustrious career in media and in marketing. How would you describe yourself now, today?
Mm. I've been trying, I'm a fairly verbose person, and I've been trying to get to the point lately. And I think that in a word, I would say that I'm a world builder. And in more words, I would say that I am a community builder, nurturer, and content creator, but more, I hate the word content. It's like, it just feels like ephemeral digital trash at this point. So
Yeah.
let me say it differently. I'm a community builder and a storyteller in equal parts, and I think the two are mutually exclusive. You need both to be able to build, to know how to build a healthy community, and you need to be able to reflect people's experiences back to them through artful storytelling. Um, and I think that's why I ended up in marketing, which is an industry that I have a lot of complicated feelings about.
I have no doubt that you do, as do I, and we'll shelve that for another day, another
Totally.
conversation. As you were speaking, it occurred to me that probably community and storytelling are so important to you because they've really helped you heal.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
I was hoping you could share a little bit about like the importance of storytelling and community and your own various healing processes.
Yeah. I think this is an appropriate venue to say that, I identify with Chiron a lot. And I think of myself as a wounded healer.
Mm.
And I think of myself as someone who processes my own wounds through communicating them and amplifying them to allow other people to feel less alone. I think I transitioned, I'm trans and I medically transitioned in 2000, so the relative dark ages, and there wasn't information. I couldn't Google something. I asked Jeeves, F to M, transsexual, how do you go from female to male? Like, I had to use this antiquated language to access information. I'm not saying that doesn't still exist in present
Sure.
day,
Yeah.
but there wasn't a lot of like what I call like lighthouse people kind of displaying themselves in a way that allowed me to understand that I could imagine a future. And so I think that I was a poet at the time, and then I started making music. And I think that my primary driver for making music was less focused on having a music career as much as it was focused on communicating with a great sense of urgency that I existed, and that by my very existence, that meant that other people like me existed. And I used my concerts and my shows as a venue to gather other trans people and to be in that space with them. So, at the time, yes, of course, I wanted to have like an illustrious music career, but hindsight, I just think my main work was to gather other trans people and connect around our very existence and how it could be beautiful and celebratory and expansive and inclusive. And I wanted to be a lighthouse for another generation of trans men and trans people. And I think that it wasn't a cognizant kind of driver,
Yeah.
but in the aftermath of it, I realized very quickly, like, oh, this is less about me and more about community.
Yeah. Yeah. I relate to that. I mean, I'm way more private than you are. But there was a couple threads I wanted to pick up on there. The first is this idea of Chiron and this idea of the wounded healer really resonates because one thing I'll always like reiterate to folks who take my classes or interact with my work is people who talk about healing and who offer tools, whether they be practical, artistic, spiritual, they're not they weren't born with everything being okay. Like, like there's usually a very like long, lonely, arduous process. There's usually a ton of abuse. There's usually like a ton of maybe chronic illness or a ton of dysphoria or a ton of loneliness, harm, like on and on, trauma. How could I forget the T word? The other T word, there's many, but like, I'm like, think of three at least that we might talk about this today. But, like there's a lot of things. And I think that for me, thinking about who I was when I was 12 or when I was 6 or when I really needed this information is such similar to you. It's such a drive to what I have done for the past decade, because to your point, I always think, well, if I'm feeling this way, there's got to be someone else out there who needs to have this reassurance and this information that you're okay. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with you. Mm-hmm. Like, even if I was thinking about this because I knew we were going to be talking, I think that because we're in such an intense period politically, and we could argue we've always been, I think that I forget that some people don't interface with the reality that being told you're wrong or being told that you are mentally ill, like, I'm thinking of course, I'm talking about queer people. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about trans people. I think,
or that you shouldn't exist, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think, there's so much there. Yes, I was forged in the crucible of chaos and trauma, my parents' unexamined trauma that they passed on to me, and then my own trauma of living with people who were, my parents who were mentally ill-equipped, probably should have never had kids, if I'm being brutally honest. And yeah, I was created in that environment, and I was, and I'm a highly sensitive person, like deeply, deeply sensitive and empathic. And I did a lot of caretaking in that space. And I think that, at the time it was abuse. It was awful. But what it left me with was a deeply refined set of skills to understand how to make everyone comfortable, which allows me to create community spaces, thinking about that, of how do I make this space at its inception really like an excellent experience for everyone who is in that space. And then the piece that you're saying about like this sort of like, we're not only like queer and trans people are not only devalued, we're dehumanized. I'm actually why am I having a hard time saying that word? We're
dehumanized.
Dehumanized.
It's a weird word. Word.
And I think that, within that, I think that I just wanted to feel my own humanity and connect with other people under the guise that we're human and we're worthy and that we can want more for ourselves. And that's hard to do in a community that is dysregulated, has our own individual trauma with collective trauma, and that we're just in this like serpentine experience of just the snake eating its own tail over and over again, where our community, and I use that term broadly, of the LGBT community, is under duress and has always been. And I often think about, I don't want to get too derailed, but I often think about, just there's no system that's built with us in mind. And in fact, everybody is oppositionally trying to dismantle any like incremental progress that we make, because I'm watching all this footage right now from 50s, 60s and 70s archival footage of the queer movement. And I'm seeing all these signs and I'm seeing like protests and rallies and gatherings. And I'm like, oh, it's exactly the same. Nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is the language. So we don't say homosexual anymore. We say queer and trans, right? Or we say LGBT, but it's the exact same fight. We're still fighting for our humanity. And while we're also fighting the opposing forces were also fighting each other, because we just constantly are meeting each other with our trauma and our desperation. And it's sort of like, if we could meet, or we could take the gloves off when we're with each other and have the understanding that there's the best intention when we put something forward to create for this community. But when people are unresourced, they're unresourced.
Yes.
So I often think of myself as like, I am resourced enough to take care of other people who are unresourced and who are going to be innately resentful, harmful because they're harmed, and upset that I'm offering them something. And I just try to like resource myself as much as I can. I think of Jameson Green as a mentor of mine. And he once said to me, the only way that you can approach long-term activist work or advocacy work in this community is if you realize when you are tapped dry and you exit and you go and you recharge and you have a quiet space where you can heal with people who really know and love you, like really know and love you, not fans, not supporters, not like quote unquote community members, but your intimate circle. You recharge there, and then you get back into the circle of hell doing this work together. You know, I say that jokingly, but
I know. Listeners have to know that Rocco and I don't think I said this, Rocco and I are very old friends, and we've known each other for a very long time. And I consider you one of my close friends. So we can we can enjoy our dark humor together. And hopefully you will have a chuckle or two with us or at us. We don't really care. We've been on all sides of that.
Wait, let me ask you, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you think that those of us that are formed in this like sort of chaotic environment and then are drawn to do somewhat altruistic kind of spiritual work of community building, community nurturing, supporting, etc., are bulletproof in some way? Because I'll say for myself, I think I've already survived the hardest part of my life because I survived my childhood. And now everything else just feels like it either like meets that mark or is not as bad. I didn't ask that in a great way, but you know what I mean?
It's such a great question. I'm gathering all of my thoughts around this. I've never been asked this question, and I've never like thought about it in terms of my own life. I wouldn't. Okay. So the first thing I want to put forth is that in positing that some of us are better equipped to deal with wounded people, I suppose, unconsciously acting out their wounds. I think we're all humans. And I think that I really want to get away from dehumanizing myself. And I think that one thing that's happened for me in the last couple of years is really trying to reassert my humanity in interactions with people who are lashing out on me, lashing out at me, whoever they may be, because I want to continue to foster a community of care, regardless of where I am, we're all just human beings. And I think that something I've talked about with you personally is when I feel like my wounds, my like original wounds are being graded against, which I'm definitely circling, I don't want to continue to abandon myself or martyr myself, because that's not healing the wound. That's not transformation. And what I think it is I think that in order to do more intense work, whether you're a social worker or a high school math teacher or anything that involves the sacredness of people's vulnerability, which, if I'm being honest, like that's most vocations really, as long like a DMV worker. I mean, my partner is a nurse. Like I could be here all day naming vocations, a real estate agent, like that are dealing with people in vulnerable situations that you wouldn't think that. We're always forgetting how sensitive and how sacred we are. And I think that what I have, and I'm assuming you have, but I'd love to hear about it, is, we have an imagination and we have compassion and we've healed enough. And we are always turning towards compassion as the baseline. And we have some kind of spiritual practice that reminds us that we're tiny little specks and that we're not that important. And also we're part of this much larger constellation.
Fully. Yeah. I think, healing is also a primary mission for me. So when I was a kid and I lived in that chaos, I have a twin sister, and she would withdraw, and she would get further and further into academia, even as a small kid. And for me, I would try to mend and glue the family back together. So I think that one of my primary missions as a person is to get a greater understanding and awareness and awakening to my own wounds and to the wounds of others, and to try and facilitate healing for myself and others. And I think, like, as you were speaking before too, when you said something about unconscious people wounding people, and I think that I've taken this lens to consciousness, or to like being awake to things, in this way that, like, it's interesting that so many people had babies during the pandemic. And I just think, for my own self, I just think, like, we're facing climate change in this way, that how can you, like, what is the cognitive dissonance that allows for that to happen? And I think, like, sometimes I think about the privilege of being asleep, and how there is an inherent sort of privilege to not have to wake up to realities, and experiential realities, where, I'm never going to fully understand what it's like to be a man of color, but I can be awake to the harm that is potentially happening as a result of me being a white man, right? And if I can wake up to that, then I do less harm. But I can't just wake up and then, like, be like, I'm awake. You have to invest in constantly doing the work to be awake, and to be consistently awake, and to wake up to other things. And I often will look at people in my life who are unconscious, and just think, like, that seems so relaxing to not have to, like, deal with all.
Spa. It's like a permanent spa.
Spiritual and emotional spa. Totally.
It's very uncomfortable. And I think that I wanted to sort of speak to, or ask you, because I'm really glad you brought up healing, because that was actually one of my first questions that I had for you. The healing you've done is so vast. Obviously, we all have our process, and there's always more to go. There's always more to heal. Mm-hmm. What have been some of the more important tools for you? Like, what were some of the one or two big puzzle pieces that really facilitated some emotional or, like, heart-centered growth for you?
Ooh, man. So I've done a lot of thinking about this too. I think that, like, being in intimate relationships is such a lovely mirror and potential accelerant for individual growth. And being a twin allowed me to grow up with that mirror of understanding what it looks like to invest more in thinking versus feeling. I love feelings. I love talking about feelings. I love thinking about feelings. And I didn't grow up in a house that prioritized that in any way, shape, or form. I asserted that I needed therapy when I was 13, and I was met with my father telling me that it's for weak-minded people. And I said, that's great. I guess I have a weak mind and I need some help. And I went to therapy, and I've been in therapy on and off for most of my life, and I love therapy. And I also have been in a relationship, like a romantic partnership, for the majority of my life from 14 on. And that has allowed me both healthy and unhealthy relationships, or healthy relationships that became progressively more unhealthy. That has allowed me the opportunity to really see myself outside of myself and see the impact that I have.
Yeah.
And because I'm so relationally focused, I don't just do that with like an intimate partner, but I do it with all of my friends as well. And I'm available to hear how I try to work on being open and receptive and dropping my defenses and understanding people. I think about one of the most healing things, like the gift that I was given in my life, has been the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. And I'm not a religious person. This is a 12-step prayer. It's actually the 11th step prayer. 12 steps also really help you get your shit in check. But that prayer is like the biggest takeaway for me is like, it is better to understand than to be understood, because it's through understanding that you are also understood. And I think about that every time I have conflict. So I think, okay, what's happening for this person? They're fighting me. They're defensive. Why are they fighting and defensive? And I think it's because they don't feel seen or heard. At the core, we all just want to feel seen, heard, held, and loved. Like we're all driving towards being understood and loved. And if I can
safe.
Well, you feel safe if you're understood, because then you're like, oh my God, this person sees me. They can hold this space for me. So I think about that even when I've been trolled because I'm a public person. And even when someone comes to me, I'll use a better example. I run this camp for trans men, adult trans men, called Camp Lost Boys. And there was a moment, and I have a chat there that's for guys who have been on testosterone for longer than 10 years. And it's a fishbowl style chat where the guys who have long-term hormone use are talking about their experience, and guys who are less far along in their transition listen and ask questions. And I said something about how, that the medical care that I received 20 years ago is this antiquated experience of having to prove your identity. You have to go to a therapist. It's Harry Benjamin standards of care. Those don't exist anymore. And I said that it's much easier now. And later that day, a younger guy came up to me, and he was crying and he was shaky and he was so mad at me. And he came in like fisticuffs, like ready to fucking fight me, and was like, how dare you say that? I know what it's like. It's hard now too. And he was like yelling at me, and I was like, okay. And I felt I'm very reactive because I have been, I see myself as reactive.
I don't see you as reactive at all.
Less and less. But in those moments, I'm like, oh, we're fighting. Okay, my gloves are going on, and I have a fucking excellent KO record. So let's go, little guy. So he said all this shit to me, and I was like, okay, what's actually happening for him? And I took a deep breath before responding, and I said, I know it's still hard. I'm really sorry that you have had time accessing medical care. Tell me about it. And then he talked to me about what it was like in his small Midwestern town accessing care. And at the end, he wasn't pissed at me anymore. We had a hug, and he was like, thank you for holding that space for me. And I just think, like, if you can do the difficult, sometimes saintly work of putting yourself aside, if it doesn't take too much from you, even in your intimate relationships, like with my wife, I think sometimes we have these fights where it's like, I'll say, oh, that hurt my feelings. And then she wants to defend it. And I'm like, I'm just telling you about my feelings. Can you hear about them? Can you tolerate them? And then same goes for me. She's telling me this hurt. And I'm like, oh, well, I didn't mean to hurt you. Right? And we're constantly meeting each other in this battleground where it's like, all in pain. We are all in pain. And no one's pain gets held and heard, because we all want our pain to be the pain that's held and heard first. And it's like, if you can do the difficult work of putting yourself aside, holding that space for the pain, then chances are that person's going to be like, tell me what it was like for you, right? Which is what happened with that kid at camp. It's like, I held that space for him. And then he said, I'm sorry I didn't hear, after we were done with him, he came to me and said, I'm sorry I didn't hear. It must have been what it was like for you. It must have been really hard and lonely. And I just think, okay, great. So we both get to be understood. The other last piece that I'll share in terms of tools is, I think that sometimes if we don't know ourselves well, we become, I'll say, less safe. So one way that the pandemic allowed me to understand myself is that my greatest desire for people's perception of me is to be seen as a safe person. And I want that so desperately that I will backbend, I will contort myself, I will abandon myself to make that person feel safe in that moment. What I realized was when I do that and I self-abandon, I'm not safe. And then it became this huge motivator for me where I realized that when I self-abandon, I'm not safe, which means that I have to be authentic to myself first. And it's that basic ass saying of like also recovery where it's like, put your own mask on before you put someone else's mask on. And I don't think that I had learned to do that. So that felt like graduate level emotional healing for me, because now instead of, because I am like self-aware in some ways, like I know that I am a white, cis passing, straight passing, masculine man. And my trans experience is not always visible to people. And as such, then I'm read as a white, cis, straight guy, which means that there's inherent power always, right? And so in every room, I'm at the apex power point, right? And I think that within that, I always want to make myself smaller and I want to make room, but I do so in a way that abandons the fact that I am also innately a leader. I know how to lead. It's my natural state of being.
You like it?
I didn't until I had this like safety revelation, because I felt like being a leader meant that I was taking up too much space, and that if I'm taking up too much space, I'm taking away from people. But what I realized is that the people in my life, people I do business with, people that I work with, they want me to lead. They want to follow the direction that I'm setting. And I'm the kind of leader that's open to hearing, like, I'm not like a dictator. I'm super collaborative. So people want people who are good at leading to lead the way for things. And once I realized that, it allowed me to like all of my business and friendships and relationships shifted, because I realized that like in order for everyone to feel safe, that meant I had to also feel safe. And that's the graduate work shit, because I'm like, oh, I've never prioritized my own safety. So for the past like 2.5 years, I've been on this journey of like a deeper layer of healing, where it's less about healing people outside of me and it's more about healing me and seeing who can sustain that. Who can take care of me when I don't contort myself and self-abandon, and what friendships survive that. That dynamic of like, because I also, as a result of like trying to make people comfortable, I see that like my friend who makes mean jokes all the time, and I'm his sacrificial lamb for the mean jokes, because it's a way for him to showcase that he has dominion or a deeper relationship with me that can sustain him making fun of me in front of other people who aren't deeply connected to me. I see all of that trauma and I'm like, that's okay. I can take it. And I think now I no longer take it. I just don't, just because I can take something doesn't mean that I have to. And that's the core wound kind of shit, where in all of my friendships, I'm like, I don't like when you make those jokes. And then I have to say that to him. And if he's like, fuck you, whatever, then I know that that's not a healthy relationship for me moving forward.
And I think that I think that what you're bringing up here has been a large reality for so many people over the last 2 years, because there was that, for many of us, we were forced to turn more inward and reflect. And with that came what we will and won't accept in our lives, for sure. As you were speaking, I don't want to get too derailed, but it just something occurred to me. I'm wondering how much of your people pleasing tendencies were or are, or you think might be wrapped up in your masculinity. Because I was having this conversation with a couple friends probably a couple months ago, and one was my partner who's trans, and one was a friend who's trans, who's a trans woman. And we were like, if there were no repercussions, no punishment, nothing would go wrong, we would be safe. What would we do more of, and what would we do less of? And my partner, who very similar to you in terms of you're both very charming. You're both people. You're very people-y people. My partner was like, I would tap dance less. I would stop trying to make everyone feel so comfortable all the time. And I asked him, why do you think you do that? And he's like, I do that because I'm a man. And I know that I'm a man. Like I have the awareness, like as you were saying, of your power and your privilege, you know, because similar to you, my partner passes and he doesn't want to make people feel uncomfortable, you know? Like, do you think that that's part of it?
Oh yeah, it's definitely part of it. I mean, the people pleasing pre-existed my my being read as male full time. I think I said that in a clunky way, but my relationship to my identity is antiquated, so pardon me.
Was it created in 1991?
But yeah, no, I think that, you know, trans masculine culture is helping culture. I think that trans men and trans masc folks that have done the work on themselves have an inherent understanding of patriarchal masculinity and how to sort of like do their best to extricate themselves from it. And I think that, you know, I think the community also demands that of trans men and trans masculine people. So there's the dual pressure internally and externally to be quote unquote better, or to like not be a man, or to be less of a man, or to be a different type of man. And I just think like that feels like a blunt hammer. And I think I've done a ton of work on and always am engaged in consistent work on my relationship to men and masculinity. And a huge part of sort of extricating myself from that pressure was also in the creation of camp. I think in large part, my music career, all things that I've done, my music career, Original Plumbing Magazine, Camp Lost Boys, all of this has been about me creating something for other people to feel less alienated, alone, whatever they're feeling, whatever I was feeling. All of it is, the end result is creating for others. And then camp was the first place that I finally got the gift of receiving what I created. And I had never been in a space, and camp is for men of trans experience who have a more binary relationship to their identity, because as the community grows and as identities continue to expand and our interpretation of gender is registered via language and alternative routes to getting that into that space, I like to think of expanding gender always instead of ending gender. And I do think that some of us identify in a fairly what has become an antiquated kind of identity of being like a transsexual man that is a binary identity and a fairly normative relationship to our maleness and our masculinity. And that's super unpopular in the queer community. And that's hard. That's a hard burden for an individual person to kind of like digest. And the magic of that space of Camp Lost Boys is that it's only that identity. And I think I have this opening night dinner where I address everyone and I say, you don't have to worry, no matter where you are in your medical transition. If you opt to not have a medical transition, no one will ask you your pronouns. No one will misgender you, and not camp staff or campers. Everyone is he, him. Everyone is a man. This weekend, you get to put that baggage aside, which is why it's so vital. But then I also tell them this week, you don't have to worry about how much space you take up. Take up all the space. And I think like when I said that the first time, I was like, it gutted me. I started crying and I realized like I've never been in a space where I could take up all the space. You know, even in that space, I try to think about how I'm taking up the space, but like, the digested piece for everyone that goes is like, I've never been in a space where I didn't have to worry about making room for more marginalized or challenged identities than my own. And that wasn't part of why I created that space, but the output of it is, it's the reason why most people who come back over and over again, because it's the only time of year where they don't have to like deeply, deeply, holistically consider whether or not they can even use their voice, or to what your partner said about tap dancing, that sort of like codependent comforting tap dance that we all have sort of like sewn into the fabric of our masculinity so that we can prove to the community that we're better men, or that we're not like toxic men. And I even think the conversations that happen around maleness and masculinity via trans men or trans masculine people also feels unnuanced and like a blunt hammer for the most part, in this way that I just think my hope is that for masculinity, that we start to really reshape the conversation and do away with this idea that masculinity is toxic instead of the patriarchy, and white supremacy being toxic, and that men are implicated. They're on the other side. Right. So systems that fail women and non-binary people or trans-identified people who don't identify binarily, it's still failing men. They're in that like man box, right?
Yeah, I want to talk about, that's also one of the questions I had for you. As you were speaking, when you were talking about, taking up space and feeling safe to take up as much space as you need to take, I also started thinking about colonialism and about how colonialism creates this lens through which we see power, and power through the lens of colonialism and white supremacy is inherently power over, and there has to be the aggressor and the dominant, and and that's terrifying, obviously, instead of like a power with. And I'm wondering if you've experienced in camp the magic of a power with, not like power over. I'm wondering how folks negotiate a space in which there doesn't have to be a power over relationship with one another. Have you seen the magic or collaboration or healing? Like how has that looked like?
It's so hard because I'm so deeply inside of it, but also outside of it. One of the, an older stealth guy who hadn't been in community for like 15 years. He just like lives in Orange County, works as an electrician, is like Silver Fox, like transitioned 25 years ago. He said once like, oh, it's like you're a ghost at your own party, about my experience at camp, which really resonated. I was like, yeah, I am sort of floating above and adjacent to this party that I've thrown. And I think so it makes it hard because I'm so on top of it. But I will say that like, I think that there is a soft, deep vulnerability that is the culture of that camp. And it's really just intrinsic to the space. And I had never linked it to the fact that there's not this like dominant sort of power dynamic. We're all on this equal footing. Like there's a very specific point that we don't allow pictures. We like people to put their phones away. We don't highlight like leaders or influencers in the space. There's no performance. There's no stage. It's all very like, we are all lateral to each other, and everyone matters in the same amount. And I think that culture is really just the foundation of that culture is deep, open vulnerability. And I mean, I think that's why whenever I do camp, which I'm doing once again in the end of this month for the first time in 2 years, I think that whenever I get back, I'm like, I wish I lived there. I feel this deep like sorrow that it's over, where I'm just like, fuck, I wish there was a way that I could figure out how to live at camp. But I'd never linked it to that of like, we get to put the bags down, like all the bags get to be dropped off for that.
What are some of those bags?
Oh my God. Like the pressure to perform at my best everywhere. So it's like a holistic experience of like the concerns and fears of external pressures to be the best, whatever that means. And I think we can all kind of like assign our own narrative to that. So like, if you're a person who does public work in any way, shape, or form, or to your point, like any type of work you're doing, there are expectations, right? You're not at work there. So you're literally just playing. I mean, there's like activities and deep, heartfelt conversations. That's the structure of camp. So it's like you're doing archery, and then you're talking about how to navigate long-term mental health needs around transition. It's like ping-ponging between like playing volleyball, which is a simple thing of playing volleyball is like the most majestic experience because you don't have to worry about how your body is being perceived in space.
Right.
Or like the big swim party that we have at the last day. No one is concerned about their body.
Right.
It's literal freedom from these constraints and expectations of how you're quote unquote supposed to be. Yeah. All of that falls away for everyone that attends.
Well, and to underscore this idea of safety, in my own experience, you know, being in a long-term relationship with someone who's trans, going to the beach can be a situation of terror. Like there's this surveillance, and underscoring that is the possibility of deep violence or unsafety that, again, I think not everyone understands. I think a lot of people in the United States do actually understand, and I would extend that to cis straight men. Like I think we all understand it, but I think that it's so it has the potential to be so interwoven into folks' experiences in a way that myself as a cis person could never experience. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about today, and I know you're just one person and this is the biggest, broadest question, you know, you've done so much work to facilitate healing spaces for healthy masculinity. You have your workbook for healthy masculinity. You've done a lot of thinking. You've given talks. You know, this is your deep work. I was hoping you could talk a bit about the potentials for a world in which we were practicing a more healthy masculinity. You know, what does that look like?
Oh man, that is a big question.
I know, I'm sorry. It's like a 400-page book. It's not like a 2 minute.
Yeah, it is a big question. I think it's like I think that we need to have, this sounds counterintuitive, but I think that, you know, the first time I went to camp, I used to identify as a deep man hater. Like it was a core facet of my actual expressed identity. I would say it loud. I would say it proud. And I thought that it was like, I mean, it got applause from most of my circle of friends. And I think that, you know, I had memorized the Scum Manifesto by Valerie Solanas and felt deeply that men were just genetically incomplete women and that the only type of man were, because she talks about chromosomally, like, you know, like really toxic kind of relationship to men. My relationship to men and masculinity was toxic. Go for it.
Pre or post medical transition?
Always. So from 14 till the first camp in 2014. So after I left camp, I had this revelation where it was such a healing space. And I remember looking at the variety of expressions of masculinity at that camp. And there were 100 plus guys. One guy was in fatigues all weekend. He was just this big burly bear, 6 foot, probably 250. And he was like making friendship bracelets. Just sitting making friendship bracelets most of the time, and like getting the littler guys to come and like sit with him and like make friendship bracelets. And then like, you know, guys like someone who had turned 18 the day before camp and lived in like Nova Scotia, didn't know a single other trans person, had not begun his medical transition, and was properly gendered the entire weekend, and what a profound effect that had on him. But I remember leaving and thinking, I can't hate men if I love these men. So if I was so moved by the beauty and breadth of masculine representation here, do I not see trans men as men? Yeah. Do I not see myself as a man?
Yeah.
And I mean, I was like, you know, I'm like deep into my transition. I'm 21 years into my transition. And it was only that moment that I had this whole other kind of like foundational layer of accepting men, because I went through ebbs and like peaks and valleys with my own, like, oh, maybe I don't hate men, maybe I only hate this type of man, maybe I hate this type of male behavior. And it was in that space that I realized I had always kept myself separate from being fully implicated into manhood in a way that I hadn't like taken the blinders off. So when I saw that, I was like, fuck, I have to do this whole other layer of deep work to understand how much, like how deeply kind of mired I am in man hate and what that actually means. And I think like, you know, the LGBT community or the LBTQ community doesn't do a ton of investigating of like, how do they or detangle themselves from hating men righteously. And I think there's a righteousness to hating men, but it was at that camp that I realized that I couldn't do that anymore, because it meant that there was a layer of like a lack of self-acceptance and a lack of acceptance for trans men as men. And so I want nothing more than to see trans men as men. And I want nothing more than to accept myself at like when, you know, when I'm closing my eyes for the last time, I want to feel like I did the work to really get to the core of who I am and loving that. And that camp allowed me to sort of get to the beginning of that process. And then, you know, and then ultimately I was like, how do I help other men heal? How do I heal myself through helping other men to heal? And then I wrote the workbook for the Mindful Masculinity workbook. That is just a literal 101 practical guide to masculinity, to having healthier masculinity. And I realized also the through line is that you have to do this in community. You can't do it in a vacuum. You have to be practicing it with other people. So I have like a weekly men's group that I participate in where we talk about vulnerability and, emotional things. But I think that like, you know, there are a lot of like mytho-poetic men's movement groups where it's like, they focus on archetypes like the warrior, the, you know, whatever, the father, like, it's just bullshit. It's like, you can't do cosplay masculinity. We're in a tactile, anything is good, right? So any attempt is good. But when you are not using it in a practical way, you're still going to harm, right?
Got it.
So you can be like, we're wrestling to wrestle the demons out of us. But it's like, okay, and then how do you bring that home to your wife who is like buried under the oppressive force of your dictatorship? Like, how does it translate to practical implications and so that you're actually doing more to do less harm? And I think men need to do that work. Men need to be actively engaged in it. I would love to see a cultural shift in how we talk about toxic masculinity and reframe it as problematic, and that it's a problem that we're all actively working to solve. And I think that, go for it.
Yeah. Please keep talking.
I think that men need to do the work together first and separately. And that work needs to be rooted in understanding that they are the beneficiaries to varying degrees based off of like experience, everything, all other identities.
Race, class.
Exactly.
Ableism, weight, all everything.
And that work needs to also be sewn into the men's work. So men need to do this work together and they need to teach each other. So a man who has done the work to improve himself needs to translate that to work for other men. I just think it's their responsibility. And then I think that everyone needs to be actively engaged in dismantling the patriarchy.
Yeah, there was so much there that I wanted to talk a little bit about where, there's a lot of things. So once again, I'm trying to gather what I hear you saying is you don't hate men. It is the gender construct of men. I'm putting this in quotes. Masculinity. I'm putting this in quotes. It is heteronormativity. It is a power over white supremacist dominant, feelings last, logical, Cartesian, material, so on and so on and so forth, that you're questioning, that we unravel, unpack, interrogate, and put forth something different, something that is more healing, something that has much less harm. There's that piece that I think is really important. The other piece that I think is really important that you discussed is this idea of toxic masculinity, something I've been thinking quite a bit about, and I have no solution. I have no end. I have no period to the end of the sentence. It's just more of a rumination that I've been understanding in this time. There are so many people who are great at naming the problem, and we need those people. We need those people to say, hey, look at this. Hey, this is an example of harm. I sometimes wonder if it isn't a bit of a 101, and that, as you're saying, like, okay, 50s, 60s, 70s, we're still, I think about this all the time, like we're still butting against this baseline, rudimentary, like issue of basic humanity, basic rights, like basic, like not even all the full human range of rights, but just like crumbs, right? We're still just trying to get there. And there's so
like
much
access to being able to dictate what you do with your body, like basic bodily autonomy. Yeah.
And
nothing extra.
I'm great. Oh, no, not one bell, not one whistle. No. And I think that what I'm so appreciative of you highlighting here is like, you are going beyond that. Here's the problem. Yeah.
I mean, other scholars have done a better job of naming what the problem is than I could ever do, because it's not my deep like scholarly approach. I come at everything from a very embodied approach, and then very practical and tactile. So would I love to be a brain on a plate? Yes. But the harsh reality is that I am a 5'3" transsexual man who has had to like do a bunch of shit to get in a body that even resembles something close to what I wish it was. And I think that I can't be a brain on a plate, and I'm not going to digest culture that's already being digested by people who make it their primary focus of years of reading, of a dissertation, all of that. So my hope is, how do I strip away some of the naming, shaming, and blaming, and allow and offer up tools to practically integrate how to do things differently. So, I think about Thomas McBee or like Chloe Stiller or Liz Plank. All of them have written these books that are digestions on or ruminations on masculinity that are more than I can do, that are not my primary driver. And I think, okay, we take all of this. And now the overarching theme for men is they're like, great, we're fucked, we're awful, fuck you. So I just think, how do you bring them back to a baseline of being like, you're not the problem. You're in a system that is failing all of us. Here's a bridge. Will you cross it? Will you do the arduous work of setting your ego down and setting aside some of your privilege to look at what it feels like to be a Black trans woman and operate understanding that that's her reality every day? How do you stop saying, I'm an ally, and get involved in real practical solidarity work? What does that mean for you? And then, if 52% of the population, or if there's more women than men, and there's more and more non-binary people, how do men start to take an actual lens of not like diagnosing themselves? Because a diagnosis is not helpful, in my opinion. You get told that it's the things afterward. A diagnosis is an illumination to a situation that you then have to take steps to manage or heal, right?
Well, a diagnosis is the like open door.
Correct. Yeah.
You walk through it.
But if the diagnosis is terminal, then everybody's like, well, fuck, who cares? Cancel men, right? And that's my biggest problem with cancel culture in general, is it's a diagnosis, but it's often a diagnosis that is terminal. So it's like, there's no hope embedded into it, which is why even reframing toxic masculinity as saying that it's problematic, then it gives us hope. okay, you have a problem. Let's solve the problem together, instead of being like, this is garbage and it's toxic garbage, so put the hazmat suit on and take it out. You know what I mean? I just think like my primary mission is to like de-escalate, allow people to be less inflamed, and then open the possibility towards more expansive healing that has a ripple effect. The greatest gift from doing that book, two things. One is that people have been asking, will you do one for young boys? And I think like, oh, that's lovely. Yes. And then two is I get messages from cis and trans guys who say that they've done it with their dads and their brothers. And I'm just like, fuck, collective healing, like healing in like a family of origin. That's like, what a beautiful gift, right?
That's
I
why
want
you
men
do
to
it.
want to do healing work. And I think men have never been invited to heal. That's why they all kill themselves, right? I mean, the highest suicide rate is for men, white men over the age of 60.
Which is both completely understandable and also shocking.
Yeah. Well, part of toxic, quote unquote, toxic masculinity is that you're not allowed to be vulnerable. So how the fuck are you going to heal if you can't even show your like underbelly? You know what I mean?
I was just talking about this today, where I'm really glad you shared that you're highly sensitive, because I think that a lot more men or masculine people are highly sensitive, but we live in this culture where as soon as you are a man and you're publicly showing emotion, you're crying, you get made into a meme. Totally. You're like within 60 seconds that you are made into a joke. Mm-hmm. And I think that the fact that we're still just at that level of not allowing men to express emotions tenderly is wow, you know? And I'm just really, really grateful that you came on to talk about this. I feel like I could talk to you forever, but I want to be mindful of your time. I hope maybe you can come back on and we can talk about some of the other things I wanted to ask you about. But this was such a great convo. Rocco, is there anything else that you want to share? Anything else that's been helping you out? Tips, tricks, techniques?
I mean, I love that the focus of this conversation and the through line was like individual healing translating to collective healing. I really think like, I just hope that, I think more than anything, the past couple years with the pandemic and quarantine have removed us from each other. And there's less opportunity for collective healing when we're these disembodied memes or social accounts. And my biggest hope, it sounds like so pat, but my biggest hope is that people just continue to have more and more kindness towards themselves, because if you like, or even dare I say, love yourself, then you're able to like, it's a revelation. If you can actually authentically, deeply love yourself, then you become a safer person for other people, because all you're coming from is a place of authentic, deep love, right? So that's my highest wish for everyone, is that there's more love, more kindness, and that we all like understand that everyone is traumatized and fucked up. It's impossible to be a human being at this point in history and not be deeply traumatized and hurt.
Yes, indeed.
I appreciate you letting me have this conversation with you.
That was so great. I love you so much. Rocco, where can people find you?
You can go to my website, roccokayiatos.com. I'm out there. I'm available for storytelling and community.
Oh, you are? Building. You're on the internet? You're accessible?
A little bit. I'm not really on social anymore, but if you do follow me on Instagram, Rocco Catastrophe, but I never post, but I'll see you.
And can people get your workbook?
Yeah, it's still available through AK Press. If you visit my website, ROCCOKAYIATOS.com, there's a link out to the book.
Beautiful. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.
that's it. It's what we've got for this week. I am sure this conversation gave you lots to think about, maybe even a wee chuckle or two, and maybe even more to practice. Give Rocco a follow on social media, the social media he is never on. And if this resonated with you, do get his workbook, the Mindful Masculinity Workbook, a practical guide to healthier masculinity. It is a workbook that provides an intensive and immersive, step-by-step, self-guided, solution-oriented tool bag for all men and masculine people looking to expand their views, unpack the patriarchy, or just get a better handle on identifying their feelings. Sounds good to me. Have a beautiful week, everyone. I will be back soon. Until then, be good to yourselves and one another. Moon Beaming is brought to you by the Moon Studio. It is created and hosted by me, Sarah Faith Gottesdiener. It is edited by Rose Blakelock with a lot of additional help from Hazel Frew. It is supported by our beautiful patrons, which you can join over at patreon.com, The Moon Studio. If you would like to further support the podcast, you can sign up for a sponsorship. You can rate and review it or share it with your friends or on your social media. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you so much.